Hi guys, welcome to round 6 of ASDC. My name is Jay. Currently with me is Leomar and Sufio on the motion that this House believes that developed countries that were historically primitive have moral obligations to give up part of their land to nations that will sink due to climate change. Without further ado, we'd like to invite the Prime Minister.
By 2020, the Maldives are going to sink. By 2020, the infrastructure and natural resources and the land of Maldives will cease to exist. By 2020, the people of Maldives simply have no place to live. We don't think this is just simply the fault of nature, right? We think that this is in fact a fault of people. We cannot just blame nature that these lands are simply sinking. We need to acknowledge that when these developed countries such as the US and UK and China were industrializing so heavily and knew the consequences of this, they do in fact have some reparation that they owe to these kinds of countries. Government side believes in three important things. Firstly, we think that the impact of the industrialization period of the US and Europe, of the UK and China was so great, and they knew the impact of their industrialization. They knew and they were not ignorant of the fact that the smoke and the carbon emissions coming from their factories are simply not going to exist only in their territory, but they knew that the effects of melting ice caps are also going to affect other countries. They knew that at the cost of other people's lives and the cost of other people's countries and natural resources down, that they will in fact prosper. That's something that we have to acknowledge. Secondly, we think that justice extends not only to some sort of personal crimes such as murder and rape, but it also extends to injustices formed by countries, right? That's why we also punish genocide. That's why we also punish and sanction countries for wrongdoings. We need to acknowledge that there is in fact justice that has to be solved. Thirdly, we think that the current model, for example, of Maldives buying land from Australia, is simply unsustainable. Why? Because if you're going to go with the current model, they can simply jack up the prices because we need to realize that they have no other place to buy the land too, right? And we need to recognize that these countries such as the Maldives and other lands that are sinking are simply don't have as much capital as the developed countries that they have. This is a problem because if they're going to buy those lands, they simply have no other money to actually innovate in that land or in that territory that they're going to get. What is our proposition coming from government side? And here we have 3 points. Firstly, what we define as developed countries are countries with trillion-dollar or billion-dollar industries. Countries such as China, the US, and UK have historically and factually been known as developed countries, right? So the statistics show that they are in fact the biggest developed countries and have the biggest capital in the region. Secondly, what we're going to do is that for the territory, we're going to give a commensurate amount of land. For example, if the Maldives is X big, then this is the exact same amount of territory that we're going to give from that country, maybe maybe the US or the UK. Sit down. They will not have to pay for this land, and we think that the territory can be negotiated by these two countries, right? But most importantly, we think that this territory will be treated as Maldives territory, right? Meaning they will be the ones enacting what policies they want in that territory and will not be controlled by the country that they got it from, right? This means that this territory is now going to be Maldives territory and simply cease to be US territory. Thirdly, if these countries are simply do not want to give this kind of territory, we think that you are in fact willing to sanction them so heavily that they will in fact impact their economy, right? If they gain this X amount of money, sit down, you are in fact going to also sanction them a proportionate amount and even more. Within this is still in fact in line with our principle, because we still get justice for the Maldives in terms of sanctioning them for money, because this money can now be used by the Maldives to buy that territory if that they so want. I'm going to discuss two arguments coming from a speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about accountability and reparation for the willful advancements of these developed countries, right? How we need to have accountability because they knew the impact of what they were doing. And secondly, I'm going to talk to you why the current model is simply unsustainable, right? Why when you make these plans, why make these countries buy lands is simply unsustainable for the current model. Sit down. Let's look at the context right now. The context is very simple. Countries such as the US and the UK and China, in their heavy industrialization period, knew the context of they were going in, right? They knew that in their factories sit down, they were in fact increasing carbon emissions, and they were in fact making global warming worse, right? They knew that when they did in fact increase the temperature, the ice caps will melt, and they know that other countries will suffer. Within these countries knew that that whatever they did would in fact impact other countries, right? They knew that the smoke and carbon emissions would not only exist in their territory, but also exist in other places, right? Obviously, the smoke and carbon emissions will not exist in your territory alone. Sit down. Why is this problematic? We think that this is simply problematic and important because it tells you that there is in fact something that these countries owe to these countries that are sinking, right? Because they knew that what they did and the carbon emissions that they emitted when they were trying to industrialize are going to impact other people, right? That's why even right now, in the context of the Maldives buying from Australia right now, buying land from Australia right now, the principle already stands. That Australia already recognizes there is some kind of reparation and some kind of justice that they owe to these countries, right? But more than that, we think that in our side, they don't even have to pay for this land, right? This is something that don't have to pay for. Sit down. We think that accountability must fall upon these heavily industrialized countries because they are the ones with the biggest impact on the world, right? We can concede to somewhat extent that other countries will in fact have emissions, but if you look at the emissions of these heavily industrialized regions and heavily developed regions, they're so much greater than that, or they're over the ones that are extended to other countries, right? Other countries may also emit carbon emissions, but their emissions are so great they are in fact impacting other regions. What's the conclusion of this argument? It's very simple. We think that historically, they knew that their actions are going to impact other individuals. They're going to impact other countries. And because they knew that they were going to impact other countries and other people's lives, they owe something to these kinds of countries, right? They owe the land that they're going to get, because if they do not, then people are simply going to die. Sit down. Let's get on the second argument right now on why the current model is simply unsustainable. Here's the context right now. We need to realize that everyone can agree that the people of Maldives will need a place to live by 2020, right? That's something that people cannot ignore. They will in fact need a place to live, and they need shelter, and they need a place to call home. Even assuming but not conceding that we are doing these developed countries wrong, we need to ask opposition. What are they going to do for these people of Maldives, right? We need to question how are they actually going to make sure these people are going to even have land. Because in the context right now, it's simply unfeasible for them to keep on paying for this land that they need, right? If they keep on paying for this land and they keep on jacking up the prices, they'll never have enough money to sustain their model. That's why even on our model, that's why our model is simply the best one. Why? Because when you give them that land that they simply owe and they simply justly owe, that's how they still have the capital to get that land, right? And even if these countries do not want to give up land, the sanctions that give the Maldives money will give them the capital to buy the land for themselves, right? That's why even if these countries such as the US and the UK don't want to give up land, the money from these sanctions will be enough to make sure they even buy land in the first place. On our side, what we stand for is very simple. We think that we need to recognize that we did do something wrong with the Maldives, right? That we're going to go against their lives and simply costing their land and lives. And only on our side are we going to correct these wrongs of the past and correct the wrongs of what they did. We gladly propose.
there was a clear mischaracterization by side government. And on our side, we completely reject their kind of characterization. Because we tell you that developed countries are not the kind of countries that are heavily industrializing right now. We tell you that countries like the United Kingdom were industrializing back then during the Industrial Revolution, not now. Which also means that all the kind of pollution right now that happens are more on the fault of industrializing countries themselves. We tell you it's not their fault because they never knew those kind of pollutions would happen back then. What our side believes in is simple. That firstly, these kind of countries have no moral obligation, because these kind of countries are already developed, that they have already gone through past that developing stage. And we tell you that this kind of country himself, they know their mistakes in the past and now, and that's why they propagate mitigating factors right now. We tell that when they propose the Copenhagen Accords within the European country itself, when they actively promote green technology, that's why we think that they have no moral obligation. But secondly, we tell they have no moral obligation also because that was a predecessor problem. We tell that mistakes of the leaders in the past, even when they didn't know what exactly would happen at that moment in time, cannot justify taking away the lands from you right now. But thirdly, this directly clashes on your idea of Maldives having no more place to live. We thought that we rather give them direct aid because developed countries already vested interest to protect the environment in status quo. But we don't think they have the moral obligation to take the burden to give up their land to your kind of countries. And lastly, our side believe that what is better is you incentivize current developing countries who are constantly polluting the earth, like countries like China, which was a clear, we will clarify with you their problem anyway. We tell that it's better to incentivize them to change their ways rather than putting the burden on developed countries who are not polluting the countries right now. Before I move on into the substantive, it revolves around these few principles, few rebuttals. But firstly, some clarification. They told you that the USA and the UK are developed countries. That is true. But we reject their idea that China is already developed. We thought that they're still in a phase of developing. That's why they're still polluting the environment so significantly. Moreover, they told you that they want to let, like, let's say, these kind of countries, for example, China, give up their land if they pollute the nation. But we tell that assuming that China already has so much land, China will feel that if I want to pollute the world more so that I can gain economic benefits, I can just constantly pollute the world more and just constantly give my land up to the Maldives people. That's why we tell that never solve the problem at its root. You only put the blame on developed countries who aren't polluting the countries now. Then secondly and lastly, we talk about accountability and how these kind of countries knew their problem. We reject those kind of ideas. We told you that they never ever knew the problem. We tell that during the Industrial Revolution, there were no check and balances back then, in which the UK government back then never knew that their kind of action would spoil the environment right now. There was no research to prove that your sea level will increase, that snow-capped mountains would melt. There was no kind of research back then. We tell that their side harms and put this burden unjustifiedly to this country itself. We don't think you should be blamed if you don't know the consequences. Sit down. All right, into my first substantive. Why developed countries have no moral obligation and why it's unfair to force them to give up their lands. Now, why don't they have the moral obligation? Because once again, this was a predecessor problem. Like we give you the example of the Industrial Revolution, where there was tons and tons of pollution, and the leaders back then never knew there were harms towards their kind of action. We thought that though they heavily industrialized, there was no kind of check and balances, no kind of research to tell that they are actually polluting the nation. Because all they wanted to garner last time was economical benefit. They never knew the harms of their action currently. We give you a parallel on how Commonwealth countries as a whole, like let's say Malaysia, you can't blame the United Kingdom for their mistakes in the past when they colonized us. Sit down. We tell you that just because their previous leader had a mistake when they colonized us doesn't mean we have a right now to blame the current leader within the UK itself. That's why we tell you that it's a predecessor problem. You cannot blame the current leader for those. But moreover, why is their policy unfair? Because we have to understand in status quo that developing countries are the ones that are constantly polluting the nations, not developed countries. Sit down. We tell you that United Kingdom, sure last time they were developing, but now they are not significantly polluting the world. They are promoting green technology. They are having environmental accords that constantly protects the environment. Why is this unfair? Because the current problem here is developing countries, like let's say China or Asian country. Their side forces the problem and force already developed countries who are not polluting the world right now to take that burden of what the fall of developing countries do. The conclusion to this argument is this: that it's extremely unfair to force developed countries who have not constantly polluted the environment right now to take on the burden of the mistakes of the past, which were done by their predecessors, which never ever knew what was going to happen right now. Before I move on, yes.
From third-world countries have raised up by 20% in mid-14 as compared to the 2000s. The trend is still polluting even more. So how can you tell me that they're stopping them?
Look, if you are arguing about the amount of pollution, without that, if you said, let's say you said European countries pollute 20% CO2 emission, without China even pollute more than 50%. What are you talking about? Developing countries are the main problem right now. Your side harms and put the burden on those kind of countries that never ever did a mistake right now. Those are the kind of countries that are promoting green technology. Those are the kind of countries that promote accords and systems that protect the environment even more. We don't think you should blame this kind of country. But on our second argument, why developed countries are already shifting towards protecting the environment. Like once again, these kind of countries are constantly promoting green technology. Then they have accords like the Copenhagen Accords that constantly allows countries and make countries to protect the environment even more by pledging to reduce the amount of CO2 emissions that they can reduce. Because their side forces these kind of countries to take that unreasonable burden. Because without these kind of countries are already doing their best, they constantly go to developing countries and tell them that, look, you can't destroy the environment, you can't have illegal logging, you can't constantly burn all your kind of forests. These are the kind of countries that constantly tell you not to pollute the environment. What your side does is force the burden upon these kind of countries that sure they might have polluted in the past, but these are the kind of countries that are trying to repay and repair the mistakes of the past by promoting. Their side forces developing countries to tell you that, okay, developed countries are going to solve my problem, I can pollute even more. Their side causes even more harms for the environment. For all those reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will condemn developed countries who destroy the infrastructure of smaller nations. We will condemn developed countries that destroy cities and bomb cities of other nations. Why cannot we condemn developed countries which have purposely contributed to an entire country sinking to the bottom of the ocean? What the world has to realize is that its actions, whether in the past or in the present, have contributed to something even greater, have contributed to the loss of homes, to the loss of land of millions of people, and we have to hold them accountable. Their principles will never operationalize because they've never presented us to a pragmatic to how we're going to help the people of Maldives, to how we're going to stop people from, to how we're going to stop people from sinking to the bottom of the ocean. What will I do as a second affirmative speaker? Firstly, I'll have 4 points of response to the previous speaker, and then I'll provide you a substantive on how we make sure that the development of further nations become sustainable. But before that, a couple of responses to the previous speaker. Firstly, let's tackle their counterpart of giving aid and promoting green technology. No amount of aid can stop land from sinking to the bottom of the ocean. They have to realize that they have to be more pragmatic. They have to realize that they have to answer the problem even more. But secondly, nothing on their side will incentivize developed countries from improving their industries, right? Nothing on their side can incentivize them from being more economically friendly. Rather than our side, they have to realize that they are accountable, and if they're not accountable, then we'll sanction them and give the money to countries like the Maldives. Everyone later. Secondly, this idea of the predecessors back in history, back in the 17th century. On the first of response, it wasn't that far back ago, ladies and gentlemen. Even back in the 1980s, there were studies that showed that global warming was on the rise. Countries like the US, countries like China already knew that, yet they still kept drilling for oil, yet they still kept building industries. Everyone later. But secondly, even if you're going to work in that context, even people back then knew what they were doing, right? There was the Black Smog of London back in the 1800s that killed 6,000 people, right? Even they knew that they were causing air pollution. But secondly, let's tackle this whole nitpick on China. China's not developing, right? Are you kidding me? China is the second most industrial nation that exists. China has the most money in their reserves. Yes, we can count them as developed. Stop going with the excuse and that China is still developing, right? Even if 16 of the world's most polluted cities are found in that country. Third level of response, right? Accountability. Yes, they are accountable. They have constantly destroyed the environment. They have constantly contributed their industries. Who have the largest industries that contribute to global warming? It's the US, it's China, it's other developed countries which have constantly built up their economies since the 1980s, even if there were studies on global warming. Last idea, right? Last idea we have to respond to. This idea that, everyone contributes to global warming, that, we can't really arbitrate it, or we can't really have a final standard. Yes, we can find the standards. That's what you call carbon emissions. That's what you call carbon footprints. We can actually measure the amount of carbon you launch into the atmosphere that melts ice caps. But secondly, even if we assume this whole idea that the amount of pollution that China has produced, that the US produced, is equal to the amount of pollution that the Philippines or Malaysia produce, let's tackle the idea, right? So developing countries are small in land. Developing countries don't have the capital. So even if we wrong these countries, it is not feasible to expect smaller developed nations to give up their land, rather than other countries like the US who are massive, rather than other countries like Australia and China who are massive in size. What am I going to talk about in my constructives, right? On this whole idea on how our policy gives an active incentive for developing countries to adopt more sustainable methods of economic growth. Before that, anyone?
Pushes the burden upon developed countries who already have the incentive to protect the environment. Developing countries now, the one harming the environment, you don't push any burden upon them.
What's the incentive for developed countries if they are not willing to take in Maldives, if they have to charge Maldives for land that they have caused to be sink, right? They don't have the incentive unless we show them that they are accountable, right? Because they have to realize that they've contributed to carbon emissions, right? The US is one of the largest carbon producers in the world. Tackle that piece of matter. Now let's go on to the substantive, right? We believe in two scenarios that will happen in society. One thing, developing countries will eventually become developed. And secondly, low-lying countries and islands will sink if the growth of the economies of the world are not sustainable. Because we've given to you pieces of matter and actual scientific facts, right? By 2020, Maldives will sink. And by 2050, countries like Philippines and Indonesia will have 1/4 of their land underwater, right? This is a serious problem you have to tackle because, guys, you don't have enough time left in society. What is the current measures countries employ to develop then in society? One, they think we employ no. One, do you think they employ massive and rapid industrialization, which destroys the environment? By one, deforestation, and two, carbon emissions that increase the sea levels, right? By 2050, the oceans would have risen by 1 meter. I think most of us are going to be underwater. Secondly, countries look for a more short-term form of development when they should look for something more sustainable, and they should look for something that doesn't implicitly harm other countries, that doesn't implicitly bury countries underwater. So what do we want coming from our side? What do we want from a derivative bench? We want to deter developing countries from adopting models that are not sustainable, that even if they're economically sound, will eventually just harm their countries even more, that will eventually kill people by drowning them, right? What we want, and how do we do this, and how do we achieve this with our policy? If developing countries know that at one point in time they will become developed and they will be held morally accountable for their wrongs, then they'll avoid more economic policies that destroy the environment, and they'll look for more sustainable economic policies. This is how our side is better, right? We're better because we tackle the benefits on two levels. One, you have the short-term benefit of making sure that people in the Maldives and the Seychelles won't drown in underwater, and they'll actually have homes to live in. No. But secondly, we tackle the more long-term benefit of incentivizing countries to adopt more sustainable policies, that more sustainable economic frameworks, so that they know that in the future they won't be held morally accountable, that they won't be held accountable for all the wrongdoings in the past, right? Why do we think this was a better issue in tackling the debate, right? Because we think that while the outside opposition can be strong in principle, they've never operationalized any of their principles. They haven't presented to us a pragmatic to how they're going to help the world. The best they've done is nitpick and say that, oh, China is not developed, even though it's the second most industrialized nation, that, oh, no one knew what they were doing, even if 6,000 people died in the 1800s because of air pollution, that, oh, other countries also contribute. We've actually told you the actual statistics, we've actually told you why these statistics are actually linked to the accountability of countries that are developed, that link to the accountability capabilities of countries who are massive in size and can give up a part of their who can willingly give up part of their territories to smaller countries that are sinking, like the Seychelles and like the Seychelles and the Maldives. So why do we have the higher values, and why do we strike the balance in debate? We think we strike the balance when it comes to being more environmentally sustainable to the actors in this debate. When you talk about providing a better sense of accountability for the rest of the world to live by, for the rest of the world as a narrative. If you're a developing country, you will know that you're accountable for environmental disasters, right? But if you are a developing country, you will know that you have to be more sustainable with your economic policies. It's on their side where environmental refugees have to drown. It's on their side where environmental refugees will have nowhere to live. For all those reasons and more, we're proud to propose.
There are a few reasons why side opposition will win today's debate. Because government side never proved to us why only and only developed nations themselves should take the blame for all the reasons why global warming is happening. We told you from the start that there are a myriad of reasons why the world is getting warmer, and we can not only put the blame on developed nations themselves, but everyone in the whole. And they are shifting that liability towards developed nations, and it's going to make sure that these developing nations have no incentive, because all the things that they do wrong right now will be transferred towards someone else. They don't see the harm towards their own country. They never stop that problem in itself. I'm going to talk to you about two things towards today. One, why you shift the liability and how this is harmful in two ways, right? One towards nations themselves, and how there are also many other forms that increase global warming right now, and why we cannot only punish developed nations. But before I move into that, let's look at a few contentions. One, an idea that developed nations are liable because they weren't ignorant and they knew. Hello, they give us an example that, oh, sit down. Okay, they give us an example that, oh, in the 1980s there was research that came out and then people knew about global warming. But the thing is, like, countries like the US were started in the 1800s, and countries like France were started in the 1500s, and they developed long before that research came out. So you're telling me now that suddenly, oh, they knew and they didn't want to do anything about it. We even show you, like, these countries like France and the UK were one of the first countries to actually take up the green movement as their global agenda in itself, right? We tell you they have a vested interest, not because they are morally obligated, because they know that it's a better incentive for them to contribute back towards the green movement, so they can ensure that they are put on the pedestal and people want to trade with them, etc. Right? But not only that, let's look at a few checks and balances that actually happen under status quo already. Right? We told you that right now, developed nations are one of the nations that actually contribute back towards the green movement themselves. Right? They don't have a moral obligation to do this, but they still do it anyway. Right? We tell you that this already shows that they are already evening up the playing field of the pollution that they did back then. There's no further harm that they are committing right now. Secondly, but also let's look at the pollution that is compared before and right now. Like in the world right now, there are so many more people right now, and the pollution that's actually happening is a lot more compared to once in the history, right? We told you that even if there was a lot of pollution in the history, we think that those are not the same compared to what's happening right now. Right? We tell you that right now we need to propose and ensure that all forms of people take that liability, and we need to also ensure that developed nations know that yes, they will be punished if they do continue to do this. Right? Sit, have a seat. Okay, but lastly, let's go into the comparison here and why we need to equate these both values and whether or not developed nations need to do this. Look, under their paradigm, all they're going to say is that developed nations will take in these people, and that's the only benefit that they gave, right? We tell you that under our paradigm, the comparison is this. When you do this, you ensure that all developing nations out there don't have to feel like they even need to take part in the policies themselves, because all the problems they are contributing to will now be put onto the developing nations themselves. Right? We think that this is extremely harmful. You don't take into account the pollution that these other countries are doing, and this will only incentivize them to continue polluting. Right? Before I move on, yeah, sure. Okay.
Sir, you seem to misunderstand. Even if you live in principal sensitivity and wrong the rich developed countries, you're still not giving people like me, like Filipinos, a place to live. I don't want to drown. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we already told you from the start that we will put this we will put this liability on people who pollute the most. And we think that these people who pollute the most are developing nations who know right now that yes, if you do continue polluting, that is a problem, but aren't doing anything about it, right? The problem is right now that developed nations know the pollution and they are actively trying to stop it, right? This is why they have no moral obligation to do this. Okay, but let's go into the second idea of rebuttal about the idea of incentive, right? They told us that suddenly, oh, if you do this, developed nations have to show accountability, or developing nations have to show accountability, right? But the problem is that you're only punishing the developed nations themselves. You're not actively punishing the developing nations, right? You're not actively saying that, oh, your policies will equate to you contributing harm towards society, right? You're going to allow them to continue doing this, right? And especially, you're also punishing developed nations to the most extreme harm. Because sure, there might be countries like the US who are big, but there's also countries like Japan, which is developed and one of the greenest countries in the whole world, but also one of the densest, right? And Japan is the one who instituted the Kyoto Protocol, and how are they going to give land towards any other country in South, when considering that they are the ones contributing back so much and then you're suddenly blaming them even more? We think this is extremely harmful to countries themselves who are willing to take up the incentive, because you disincentivize them even more to contribute back, because you already label them, oh, yeah, if we punish you, that's fine, you don't need to do anything else. Okay, let's go into my idea about why we shift the liability from developing nations towards only developed nations. Look, we know right now there are a lot of reasons why possibly developing nations are contributing a lot more. We think that countries like Indonesia, which already know, by the way, that there is a problem with the status quo and global warming, are still continue to allowing open burning and not trying to lock down on it, right? We think that when you do this, there's no pressure at all for developing countries like Malaysia or Indonesia or Philippines to actively take a stance against global warming. Because now all they will see and all the things that they have to fear will only happen in the future, right? We don't think that this is a good thing that we want to promote towards themselves, right? We think that what you need to do right now is to tell all these developing countries that yes, we will punish you, and then we will, if you continue polluting now, we think that we will shift all the people in the Maldives towards your country right now. This is a faster incentive compared to what they were proposing, right? Where, oh, we're only going to do this when you become developed, right? We think that this also shifts the liability to only developed nations themselves. I think this is extremely harmful. We don't think we want to take that. Because you allow someone else to take the fall for your own actions right now. We don't think that it's just, we don't think that it's fair. But okay, let's look at all the other ideas that contribute. We think that also companies that play a part in historical value also play a part in the pollution that happened. We do not think that it was the fault, or let's say the US or Britain or maybe other developed nations right now, when they didn't even know and they wanted to develop themselves because they wanted better lives for their own nation, right? We think that this historical value needs to be understood, because what happens now is that you disregard all the historical input that came before that, right? Where these people needed to live and they needed to use all the resources they could to live. But what happens right now is that they know there needs to be some form of balance, right? But they know that there needs to be some form of check and balance to try to help solve it, right? But essentially what you're doing, that you're only punishing them for all the historical actions and not punishing them for the actions they do right now. And we do not want to stand for that side of the house.
They don't seem to understand that even if these third world countries are polluting a lot right now, for the most of them, it's because they don't have a choice. Even if the Philippines wanted to become extremely green, even if the Philippines wanted to help the environment, we simply don't have the capital to do so. Frankly, while we do want them to help the environment, there are people starving right now in the Philippines. I've seen them with my own eyes, and they have bigger things to care about right now. And Mr. Speaker, we have to realize, they have a lot of principles to listen to, and they might sound nice to you, but even if they fly, there's still people that are going to die at the end of this decade. Principles don't help you when people still end up dying, when people still end up losing your life. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about justice, about principles, and secondly, I'm going to talk about how we actually help the people who need that help. Firstly, on justice, right? They told us that we can't wrong these countries, these rich developed countries, because they didn't know that they were polluting during their times of industrialization. Firstly, while we agree, no thank you. Before I go on, sit down. Will we agree that while global warming wasn't even a word in the 1800s, we completely disagree with their accusation that they didn't know that smoke was a bad thing? We gave you the idea, oh thank you, we gave you the idea of the smog of London in the late 1800s that covered London in smoke due to industrialization, where 66,000 people died. Using the report from them, they couldn't even see the other side of the street because of that industrialization. Mr. Speaker, no thank you. Anyone, even a caveman in the Neolithic period, who's had smoke from fire go up his nostrils, knows that putting smoke in the air is generally a bad thing. You can't put incompetence on them because, no thank you, it's just common sense that putting pollutants in the air, that putting smoke in the air is going to screw you over in the future. Secondly, even if the smog of London didn't exist, even if people didn't know that smoke was a bad thing, no thank you, even without intent, criminal actions that end up in people being wronged are still punished. What does that mean? Even if I don't mean to hit a little boy with my car, even if I didn't see that little boy that I hit, I still go up to jail. No, thank you. Even without intent, because these people were wronged, justice isn't just about making sure that that person who did bad gets what he deserves. Justice is also about making sure that that victim gets compensation at the end of the day. And on their side, that compensation is just not met. Thirdly, no, thank you. Thirdly, they told us that these first world countries are doing better now. We tell you no, my friend economist tells you that's wrong. Even now, in 2014, where global warming is obviously an issue, their pollutants are still being ranked up, right? We told you that CO2 emissions from first world countries are 20% more than the CO2 emissions from 2000, even if they knew that global warming was a thing. No, thank you. Next, they gave us the idea of the predecessor, right? That our president now didn't do it wrong, so we can't harm the president right now. Mr. Speaker, the Japanese Shinzo Abe, Japanese Prime Minister, didn't mean to do World War II, but he's still not allowed to have a standing army. What does this mean? If we don't punish the wrongs of our ancestors, if we don't punish the wrongs of our presidents before us, then we allow the presidents of now to commit atrocities, to commit long-term atrocities, because they know that the country is going to be wrong. No, thank you. We have to realize because the country did those things, we still have to make sure that they're punished, because there are still victims, and those victims are very real. No, thank you. Next, they told us that, well, there are third world countries who do much worse. Mr. Speaker, coming from a third world country myself, I can tell you, one, we are trying to do these things. We are trying to put more laws and policies. No, thank you, that puts down logging. But because we don't have the capital to do so, it's extremely physically impossible for us to cut those emissions. Even if we put all of our political capital behind making sure that environmental standards are put up, no thank you, if it's physically impossible, then you can't blame the third world countries. But secondly, even if these third world countries are purposefully putting down the environment, even though they can do other things, even if they did have alternatives and didn't use those alternatives, then fine. Sure, they did wrong too. Sure, we can condemn them too. Sure, we can punish them too. But the problem is this. We can't put our policy upon them. We can't force them to take away their land, because if we do so, we're taking away the money that they need more than all these rich developed countries. Even if we wanted to punish all these third world countries, because we can't, because it's unfeasible for us to do so, we can't put our policy upon them, because they still have people to feed. They still need to use that space to use startup capital and produce more capital to make sure that all of the people, all the impoverished, still get land and still get food to be able to be fed. Thirdly, okay, Mr. Speaker, why do we win this issue? We won this issue with one, we've proven to you that yes, they did know about that intent, because anyone who's seen smoke knows that it's a bad thing. And secondly, even without that intent, criminal actions without intent are still punished. Even if I don't see that boy, no thank you, on the street, I still go to jail. But what you have to realize is this. Even if we lose the principle, even if we wrong the rich developed countries, we still don't have any pragmatic coming from them. No, thank you. Even if their principles fly, and even if their principles are amazing and Shangwu level or anything like that, the people in the Maldives still don't have any place to go. They still don't have any land to go to. And this leads me to my second point. Sit down. Let's talk about pragmatics, right? Let's talk about the people that we actually have to help. What is their kind of proposal? Aid. They tell us that we're going to use aid to help people who don't have dry land to stand on. This is impossible, no thank you. This is impossible, Mr. Speaker, because no matter how, no thank you, no matter how much aid you go to, if I don't have territory, if I don't have sovereignty to put my citizens in so that they can live, that aid, no thank you, does not do anything for me. I just said, no thank you, stop badgering me, let's be a bit classy right here. We need our policy because no matter how much aid you shove down their throats, if you don't have land for them to go to, they still don't have land to live in the end of the day. They still don't have any territory to use their sovereignty on. You can't just expect aid to be shoved down people's throats and expect people to be happy when they're drowning underwater. Next, they told us that, well, maybe if we increase policies, we're going to help people, and maybe if we increase policies, people are going to be happy. No policy is going to save a country that's going to sink in the next 6 years. Even if we put down CO2 emissions by a lot, in like the next 5 years or something like that, the Maldives is still going to sink because everything that's needed to put the power as caps melting into order has already been put into motion. Even if you can put those policies, which are probably infeasible if you're cutting CO2 by that much, we don't think that we can help the Maldives because they're probably already going to be drowning, they're probably already going to be environmental refugees that have nowhere to go. Mr. Speaker, I know principle is nice, but principle doesn't matter when you do anything to make sure that principle actually happens at the end of the day. I've never been prouder to close.
Thank you very much. That is the end of our debate.
It's regrettable that Maldives have to soon drown their land, but we don't think that those developed countries have a moral obligation to necessarily give up their own land towards aiding those situations. Because we already told you time and time again, it is not necessarily their fault, and even if it was their fault, there was no magnitude at that moment in time to necessarily prove to them that it was their fault. Our side of the house already told you, we are willing to give them aid because we think that developed countries have the vested interest into helping them. We can move them out of their land and necessarily help give them aid and put them within our land, but we will never give them the sovereignty of our land. It's myopic for that side of the house to only justify their acts by the saying that the Maldives are going to die. We told you time and time again that it's regrettable, but at the same time, there is no moral obligation anyway. That side of the house has tried to take the strongest principle by saying, you know, Maldives are going to die, they're necessarily going to people going to die, we must aid them, we must help them. But at the same time, that side of the house only intended on helping those situations by allowing them to have those land. But our side of the house can also give them the survival, but this side of the house is unwilling to give up our sovereignty for those intents and for the justification that they gave that was such a failure. Because that side of the house only wanted to focus on one thing, of the survival of the Maldives, which we don't think is mutually exclusive. In a situation that the land is going to drown, we think that the developed countries have more than a greater incentive to assist them in the survival. It was never the problem in today's debate. But what the problem in today's debate was that side of the house needed to prove to us why, number one, the developed countries have the moral obligation. 3 speakers all failed to prove to us. But secondly, why it was so important for them to have to give up their land, and we don't think they proved to us anyway. 2 issues in today's debate. Number one, why developed countries do not have the moral obligation. But number two, why that side of the house, why their side harms the people of Maldives even more. First issue on why developed countries do not have the moral obligation. They talked about the impact of the industrialization period and why they need to take accountability. Number one, we completely disagree. Because especially in historical times, there was no check and balance, there was no papers to provide, there was not even a single environmental organization to necessarily put upon laws towards the environment, because there was no magnitude of problem within the environment. But secondly, there was also no environmental organization to necessarily tell these countries what they're doing was wrong, because the harms of the industrialization period was not put in magnitude and it wasn't seen in perspective. But number two, we also think that back in historical times, the problems with the environment were not explicit like they are now. So that means that even if those countries knew what they were doing is wrong, even if it was common sense, the problems with the environment was not put in a huge enough magnitude for them to necessarily know that they need to stop those situations. Because of the lack of magnitude towards the problems with the environment, that means that there was no research done. There was no research to prove to those countries that were doing those harms that what you're doing now can lead to the rising of the sea level in the future. Because of those lacks of research back in the 1800s or whatsoever, that means that those countries, even though it was common sense for them, they didn't know what they're doing now could lead to harms in the future. Yes.
If I ask them to kill a man, even without intent or knowledge, do I go to jail?
That's the problem. That's their only response. Even if intent will exist, we don't think was an intent to rise the sea level, because they didn't know that the sea level would necessarily rise. All they knew it was that they were necessarily causing a bit of harm because it wasn't put magnitude towards them. Because they knew that even if they knew that those situations could cause harm, they didn't necessarily know they would rise the sea level. They didn't necessarily know that Maldives in the future will have to suffer what the consequence they did. But secondly, on the idea of accountability, we think that you should not, we think that the accountability already exists right now. Because when the UK and European countries have the Copenhagen Accord that they necessarily signed, we think that when the US is the countries that necessarily having the most green technology and promoting it the most, we think that they have a vested interest towards the environment. But secondly, why is necessarily they have the most vested interest? Because they try to reject their characterization. But we tell you the developed countries have their credibility at stake. They have their reputable state, their reputable nature at stake, which means to say that the moment they try to harm the environment even more, their reputable state as a developed countries with responsibility will have to be at stake, and those are the harms that accord back to them, which means that they have the most interest in current status quo to assist the environment because their reputation is at stake. But secondly, secondly, we also think that when the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Accord is being signed by them and is being started by them, that proves that the incentive already existed towards them, which means that they're already taking accountability towards the action that they necessarily knew that was the harms towards them. We think that this accountability is very important for them to already take. But moreover, we also think their response to us was that because of the lack of intent, you cannot justify. But we think that those intents lies on the predecessor of the developed countries. Because especially when the current leaders didn't have the incentive to harm those environment, we think you can never blame them, especially when they're already taking accountability, something we try to fight for. But second issue, on why their side harms the people of Maldives even more. Because when it comes to developing countries, we think that the actual problem is current status quo. Because they are the ones who try to get out their developing state, they are not taking any accountability at all. Which means that the most incentive to continue industrializing. We give you examples of Asian countries, right? Malaysia, Thailand, and China. They have the most incentive to industrialize their countries, to not get out, of the developing state. But secondly, we think that they continuously pollute the environment because you push the burden. What happens if you push the burden to developed countries? Because the narrative now is that you shift it to them only. So you allow developing countries to continue the harms to the environment because that side of the house pushes it to developed countries who already have the incentive to do so. What happens when you shift away from developing countries? They have the most incentive to continue industrializing. They will never change their ways. But secondly, we also think that outside is much rather push the developing countries to change their ways and change their narratives when it comes to handling. We think that little amount of change could accord to the people of Maui, even if it was just the most little. We think that the moment they necessarily try to stop harming the environment, we also push them to necessarily move away from that. But secondly, we also think it's important for us to not push the burden to developed countries, because when you incentivize developing countries to continue their harm. But moreover, we think that the harms will quicken under their side. We think that Maldives will necessarily drown sooner if you allow developing countries to continue their harms. Because so long and so forth, you only blame developing countries know they can get away with it. We don't want that situation to happen. But what is the whip's response to us? He said that his response to us was that, because they don't have capital, they don't have a choice. But then what we're saying they don't have capital concedes to us. He concedes that developing countries are harming the environment. He concedes to us that you cannot change them. But why does that response is not legitimate? Because the reason why they're actually doing it, we don't think all developing countries are necessarily poor. We don't think all third world countries are poor. They do have the capital to change, but they don't want to change. But secondly, we also think that developing countries are doing the harms because they want to gain more capital. They want to industrialize more. We don't think that's fair for them. We don't think it's fair for them to continue the harm towards the environment. For all these reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Unfortunately, Shinzo Abe wasn't punished for the war crimes of his predecessors as well. And this shows that there is some form of difference between what your predecessors have done and you, yourself as a nation right now. If you are doing, as a developed nation, are contributing back to a society already, and are making up for the wrongs that you did already. We don't think that you have to take on more moral obligations or suddenly, oh, I have to do this, right? We think there's already a vested interest. If they want to do it, they can, but they don't have to do it. Right? There are 3 reasons why side opposition wins today's debate. 1, we proved to you why the pollution in the history 1 was insignificant in itself. But 2, there's more likely that developing nations right now are committing a more harm right now and are obviously going to shift the liability towards someone else. But secondly, we also will prove to you, and have done by the way, that Maldives will suffer even more under government's paradigm, and thirdly, how you don't stop the pollution that's actually happening. So let's look at what pollution is. We already told you and characterized you from the start that the pollution in history was insignificant compared to the pollution that's happening right now. Sure, they might say that, oh, 20% increase in the US or developed nations. But the problem is they never contended to the ideas that the developed nations themselves are actually contributing back by providing aid and incentivizing green technology. This shows that they're taking away that 20% increase and making it into helping the country or helping the world even more comparing to us. And they didn't respond to this idea at all, by the way, and we take this side of the house. But secondly, we also told you that on their side, right, industrialized nations right now do know what the harm is and are continuously contributing towards that harm. We told you from the start that the developed nations who had historical narratives and polluted, right, did not know. Right? Sure, they might say that. They did say that. Oh yeah, if you didn't know, that means, but you still have to take upon that liability, right? We don't think so, right? And we give you multiple reasons why. But secondly, even if we think that there was some form of liability, we think that the developed nations are taking that. But they are taking away all forms of liability from developing nations, right? We told you 2 reasons, right? We told you if you do this, developed nations lose the incentive, continue improving their green policies, right? Because all they're going to say is that, okay, I paid my liability and my moral obligation now, I don't need to do anything else, and they will continue polluting. I gave this in my second speaker speech, and they didn't want to respond to that at all. But secondly, we also told you that when this happens, industrialized nations now see that developed nations are taking all forms of liability and have no incentives to stop. This means that more countries like Maldives and more islands like Seychelles will continue to sink, because obviously the world consists more of industrialized nations compared to developed nations. Right? We think this is harmful. They're only propagating the increase of global warming in itself. Right? So let's go into the idea of Maldives. Which type actually says Maldives even more? We tell you on our side, we provide a more holistic stance towards this. Right? We tell that you as an industrializing nation has to take upon that responsibility. Right? We also told you from the start, because they wanted to say that, oh, industrializing nations can't do this. There are many industrializing nations out there, and they're not necessarily poor. Look at where we are right now. We have roads and we have highways right here in Malaysia, guys. Obviously, Malaysia wants to continue polluting and ignores all the facts. We think that Malaysia should take the responsibility and not some developed nation out there who has already reformed and is contributing back, right? But the thing is that you can never ascertain the only single actor in global warming, because it contributes on many different actors, and we told you that in my speech as well. Where there are myriad actors, you cannot put the blame on one single country in itself. But let's do it in the last part. How on their side they can't stop global warming, or they can't even solve what the problem that they wanted to set up, right? Because they say that, oh, you know, if we do this, suddenly we're incentivizing everyone to adopt the green movement and adopt their policies, right? But the problem is that they're not forcing anyone to adopt their policies at all. They're engaging and antagonizing developed countries who have already adopted those policies. You push them further away. You make sure that, no, there's no one to look up to in the stance of the green movement. You force the people in Maldives to die.
Thank you very much. To close the debate, y'all reply.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we don't do anything now, it won't only be Maldives who will sink to the bottom of the ocean. It'll also be Manila, it will be Beijing, it will be Hong Kong, it will be New York. Obviously, you need to employ this model now if you're going to look forward to any sustainable future. We think it was too late for the up-whip and the up-reply to save the cases of negative bench, even if we didn't see an evolution of response. We didn't see any evolution of response. When it came to us saying that even if intent was not present, even if you did not mean to lead to the deaths of thousands of people, we still have to punish your acts that have led to humanity getting harmed. Secondly, there was no evolution response. When you told you that even if it was the mistakes of our predecessors, we have to punish the people now, or we have to hold hold the people accountable now. That's why Japan doesn't have a standing army, because we want to stop the atrocities from the past from happening ever again. That's why we have to act now. As a reply, I'll tackle this debate on two levels: on the principle level and why affirmative won that, and on the pragmatic level and why affirmative won that even more. Let's tackle the principle level. The principal issue was who has more accountability. We told you that the massive industries of developed countries are the greatest proliferators of environmental damage. We gave you facts and analysis on how the two most developed countries are also the two largest contributors of CO2 emissions. That we can measure the amount of carbon you've produced. What was their response, and why wasn't that sufficient? The response was, we cannot trace accountability even with the existence of a carbon footprint, even if there are data and analysis to support it. But secondly, the response was, it was back in the time of our predecessors, so we can forgive them and we cannot punish them. We already told you that even back then, they had concepts of air pollution, right? Even back then, they knew that air pollution killed 6,000 people in London, but this is something that they've never answered. This is even something that we brought up a POI in the opposition whip speech, that even if they were utterly clueless that smoke was bad, that pollution was bad, why can we still hold them liable? In the same respect, that even if I didn't want to, even if I didn't know that I would harm thousands of people, I would still have to be punishable for actions, right? This is what we told you when it came to our government whip and when it came to our entire case, right? What else did we tell you, and why accountability has to fall in developed nations? The ones who can help are the ones who are rich and large, and the ones who can help are not the ones who are still, don't have the capital, right? Even if developing countries, even if we believe their assumption that a country like the Philippines has harmed the environment more than a country like China, who has more capital, who has more land, right? This is what we brought to you in analysis coming from our cases. This is something that this is something that negative didn't evolve the responses around, and this is something as to why we've won the principal issue. But now let's go on to pragmatics and how these principles operationalize in societies. When you talked about who can help environmental refugees more, or basically who can help the environment more, right? Their policy was relying on this sort of idea of aid and supporting green technology, have more Kyoto protocols or whatever. On the first level, we've told you from all our speeches that it's not exactly feasible if you're going to talk about how wind turbines and money can save a country from drowning. But secondly, we were able to spin the idea when you tell you that if these countries already have an incentive to help environmental refugees, why can't they extend that beyond the Kyoto Protocol, especially if their current measures are still increasing carbon emissions, right? But why were we better when it came to the pragmatic issue? We told you that we gave you benefits on providing marginal benefits on two levels. On the short-term level, it's about providing homes for people who are actually about to drown, providing homes and land for people whose nation is about to cease to exist. But secondly, it's on more long-term run, and incentivizing developed countries to adopt more eco-friendly measures, to adopt more sustainable forms of economic development with our policy, right? Because eventually they'll know that they'll become developed. They want to be held morally obliged or morally accountable for their actions. Why was this necessarily essential to debate, or was this the most important things to talk about? We think this debate was a debate about characterizations and how actors are going to respond to it, right? How developed countries are going to respond to it, and how developed countries are accountable to begin with, and how we're going to help the people this motion calls for, which are environmental refugees. We think when it was tackling those dynamics, we think it was tackling to those two most important things in the debate, affirmative still takes a hand over negative, and we think for all those reasons and more, we've never been prouder to propose, and we think this motion should stand.
Thank you very much for the debate, guys. Please cross the floor, shake hands.
Can we get some water in the wheelchair, please?